I think everyone's pretty getting very professional at this virtual meeting, so I won't spend too much time on the housekeeping, but just remember to keep your lines muted. And as I'm looking, I can tell who's muted and who isn't. There, I think Mary is not muted. Just be careful about background noise in your home. Unless you're speaking, keep it on mute. And if you have technical difficulties, I think the other important thing for everyone to make note of is to have Janine's cell number. They can text her with any technical difficulties if you get kicked out or something happens. And that is 303-921-2208. And anything else on critical information, Janine?
No, I think we've got a pretty good handle on this. I say go ahead with the meeting.
Right. Okay. So we're going to start off with some site updates from Linda Kiefer, the project manager from EPA. Go ahead, Linda.
Welcome everyone, and to anyone who's new to our calls. Before COVID, we did these in person, and since then we've been, I believe, fairly successful at having virtual meetings. We're doing the best we can with what we have. Speaking of virtual meetings, we are aware that there are 2 presidential town halls tonight starting at 6 p.m. So if for some reason you wanted to drop off this call and watch those or vice versa, these calls are recorded and they go up on a website that CDPHE manages. So if you're not familiar with where the recordings are kept, you can always email Janine, or you also have her phone number now, so you can also call her. So I usually start out the virtual meetings with a site update, and I'm going to keep it very short because this meeting, we have a lot of question answer session to it at the request of the CAG members. So this past September, one of our biannual site status reports came out, and it's the operations and maintenance remedial action update of what happened over the last 6 months. In that report, which that report itself is about 600 pages, the CAG presidents get copies of that in paper and also electronically. And there's an electronic executive summary of that site status report. So at the bottom of this front page is an update of what's happened over the last 6 months on the site. So Lisa sent that out earlier this week, so you can always read through that and get a site update from there. Some other things that Lisa had sent out this week are some responses to some comments or questions that Tom had from the August meeting. We also sent out our response to the McGinnis's surface water data review. So you should have a copy of that. And we sent out an email with how to find documents on the EPA website and some links to some recent documents that also came out starting back, I think, in June through early September. So if there are any documents or any information that you would like that you can't find or don't have the time to look for, you can always email Janine or Lisa, and we will track that down for you. And another thing that we're working on are responses to Sarah Peters' questions that she had about the stormwater permits, and that should be coming out shortly. Let's see. So last week on Tuesday, we received a large number of questions from the CAG, and the team worked really hard to put responses to that together. I want to thank Diane McMillan from Tetra Tech, who led that team to get that information ready for tonight. And CDPHE and the WSDs, and then my technical team at EPA for working to get that put together in a short period of time. So that's available for you. That's all I have for updates. I'm going to keep it short so you can have more question and answers. And does anyone have any questions on any of those items? Okay.
Okay, I think we were going to pass it over to Bonnie Rader for updates from the CAG. Oh, Bonnie, we can't hear you. Still can't hear you. Janine, can you unmute Bonnie? Oh,
Okay, can you hear me now?
yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. Sorry, I couldn't get my cursor to read. I'll keep this short too because we have a lot on the agenda tonight. I guess the first thing that we want to talk about is the responses that we've gotten from EPA regarding the surface water white paper that was done by McGinnis and Associates on behalf of the CAG. And it's our opinion that the EPA response did not address the points of the white paper. It seems that they merely reacted outright without providing supporting argument. We're going to have a letter completed here shortly that we will send into EPA that the CAG is not accepting this as a discussion. I think most of you will remember we started this CAG because of the fact that the EPA attorneys were concerned there were documents flying back and forth and the documents never seemed to settle the question. And so it was suggested that we start this CAG so that we can talk to each other, we can answer questions, and we can have a discussion. I think EPA knew that this was, the white paper was just the beginning of what we want to talk about, which is the groundwater. The white paper for the surface water was merely a beginning to get information out so that we could better understand the surface water issues and how they impact groundwater issues. And so we are moving forward with that. And our feeling when we read the response is that no one really read what we wrote. And if we're wrong, that's fine. Let's go forward with a discussion. And so I will have that letter off to you, Linda, within this next week. And we're going to ask that you not put this response on the record because we don't believe this satisfies the need of the discussion with back and forth answers. And so I will be sending that letter out to you. The same goes for the answers to Tom Krause's questions that he sent in specifically regarding the risk assessment. We have to have a discussion about that as well, because it's our opinion that the risk assessment that was done was not based on the federal and state standard of 0.35. And as a result, it looked to us like the risk assessment was done just to find a number that Dr. Berry could say that this was a safe number for people to be drinking on a daily basis. And that is not what we consider a risk assessment that is protective of our communities. And so we would like to plan a meeting in the next 2 meetings in which we can discuss the surface water presentation and we can discuss the risk assessment and the questions Tom Krause submitted. And I will be sending a letter to that effect. And also I want to thank Colorado Department of Health. We just got another list of the documents that they have in their system now. It's growing rapidly and it's wonderful. And from what I understand, we will have the RA O&M report in there sometime in the near future. So we really appreciate that. That's great for public being able to see things. So CDPHE, we appreciate your efforts. Thank you very much. And I think that would be all I'll have to say right now. We need to move on to our questions.
Okay. Whoops, did someone have something to say? Any questions? All right. So the CAG sent along questions, and there were several initial questions, but the body and the kind of the structured part of the discussion sounds like it starts with number 12I. If you all saw in the email I sent out in the agenda. So I think we're going to start there, and Diane McMillan will help to navigate these questions and responses. Bonnie and Tom, please weigh in if this is not how you want to proceed. But Bonnie, we did discuss this with Tom briefly before the call. We couldn't get hold of you, so hopefully you're okay with this. And Diane has put, or someone has put up the question 12I there.
That was me. So just to refresh your memory, the question was about a gap in the plume, and then we can go through A through E as we go. So I prepared some figures that are associated with this, and let me find the correct ones. Yeah. Well, we believe, and these are going to be kind of hard to see, so I will show you kind of the general figure, and then we can zoom in a little bit so that it can be a little bit bigger on your screen. The gap that I believe you are referring to is this portion of the plume here, and it can be shown differently based on you know, what data are collected and where the wells are sampled. So this is an example where here there's the dashed line and it shows a separation. And a couple of things to say about these is sometimes there are gaps in plumes, and it's a fairly common phenomena, especially when there's a large diffused plume. Sometimes plumes can separate, particularly when there are extraction features or treatment of the source area. So a separation of the plume is not necessarily unexpected, but you know, what's different about this particular site is the dashed lines here. So our industry standard is when there's uncertainty in the plume delineation, you denote that uncertainty with a dashed line. So in this case, this dashed line is placed where it is because the sample that was collected was at this monitoring point, MW118. And contrast that to this plume delineation, which is shown as more continuous, although there are still dashed lines depicted here because it includes sampling at MW118 and MW116. And so there are a few more wells here, so you can draw a solid line between those two. So our industry standard of depicting plumes is when you have, you know, point A here and point B here, and you have concentrations in both of those wells, you can draw a contour, a concentration contour in between them. When you may not have a well that can bound the plume within that area, you depict that uncertainty with dashed lines. And a lot of times professionals put those dashed lines in knowing other things about the site at the same time. So it's not just, you know, this one sampling event in 2019. You know, Tim and the group has been working at the site for, you know, 10 plus years, and they have ideas of where the plumes are based on previous sampling events, based on other lines of evidence. So, you know, both of these depictions of the plume are correct. And what I would say too is that these gaps in the plume are pretty immaterial to how the decision making is made at the site, whether this is a continuous plume, whether there are gaps in the plume. It doesn't change the way that EPA evaluates protectiveness or the way that the WSDs monitor this area. So that's kind of the general discussion on the first question here about the gap in the plume. And so it has all of the data from the wells in and around the plume have been included. The answer to that is yes, but the sampling strategy does depend on which wells are sampled quarterly versus which wells are sampled semi-annually or at a different sampling strategy. And those depend on the data quality objectives that are in the work plan. And so there might be a different strategy for different wells, and those are all listed in the groundwater monitoring plan. Question B, has enough sampling been done at each well for it to be included in the data? I think the answer to that is yes. Some of these wells have been in existence for more than 15 years. Most of them have been for more than 15 years and are sampled either quarterly or semi-annually. So we have a lot of data. We have a long history of data, and we can look at trends in these wells. And then question C is about, have samples been collected for all 4 seasons? The answer to that is yes for most of the wells, almost all of them in that area. And Tim can maybe speak to this, are sampled quarterly, which means that, seasonal, you get spring, summer, winter, and fall. And so the seasonal effects of groundwater precipitation or groundwater flow should be captured in that data. Question D is there any other data that needs to be obtained or added? This is kind of an ongoing question that, the WSDs and EPA and the state are always talking about. For example, one of the wells that is added to the North End monitoring plan was that MW117 well that helps kind of connect those plumes or confirm a gap in the plume if necessary. So that's kind of an example of one of the wells that has been added after communication with the state and with EPA. And then question E is kind of the same. What will you do to correct the gap in plume continuity? I think it's going to be an ongoing evaluation of how the plume looks in that specific area, depending on when the wells are sampled. So it may be something where if the concentration in MW118 is a little higher, it's a continuous plume. If it happens to be a little lower, it's shown as a distinct break in the plume. Again, this doesn't affect how EPA manages the site. It doesn't affect how they direct the WSDs or communicate with the WSDs on sampling. It's just a matter that the concentrations are so close to the detection range that just little variations, you can see it and then it's gone, you can see it and it's gone. But long term, as they continue to extract groundwater and treat the source, we would expect breaks in the plume to be confirmed by data. And those would have to be, those uncertainties would remain until we have data points where they're able to draw a solid line that depict that plume. That was my response to question 12I. Is there any questions about that? Is there any other information I can show you?
I have a question. Can I ask my question? Hello?
Yep. Of
Oh,
course,
okay.
please, of course, please
I was waiting
identify.
for Janine to.
Oh, just identify yourself, please, before you start talking.
Margie Sobey, CAG board member. I am not sure I'm going to be able to formulate my question right, but I hear a lot of saying that, well, we're not sure we're going to be able to delineate the plume because of fluctuations here and there. Sometimes it's a break, sometimes it's not a break, but that's not going to affect the way we manage anything. And the very last thing you said, which, and I really apologize, but I got messed up with not being able to unmute and know if people were hearing me. One of the very last things you said really kind of bothered me a little bit because I'm sorry, what was the last thing you said?
Just that ongoing monitoring will indicate
Oh,
how
yes,
they
yes.
depict the plume.
Yes, thank you. So
Yeah.
my question about that was, with ongoing monitoring, does that then mean you're going to start adding more wells and possibly putting some wells a little closer together? Because as probably everybody knows, I live in Murphy Creek near this plume, and I'm really very concerned that potentially the wells aren't close enough together to tell if any contamination is going on, because if the plume is narrow in certain places, then it could bypass and go right between wells.
Mhm.
So I was really disturbed to hear that over the last 10 years, it sounds like everybody's just fine with the way things are going, and that bothered me greatly. So that's what I'd like to say.
And I can understand, you know, your point of view. And I think what's important to, I guess, consider is that, you know, looking at the site as an environmental professional, you don't put in wells just sporadically. There's a lot of what we call lines of evidence that come into the placement of these wells and in the determination of whether we have enough data in order to say with confidence that we have delineated these areas. So, you know, typically things that I look for when I'm investigating a site are lines of evidence like where are the more permeable areas of geology, where's the groundwater flowing, you know, where is the plume been historically, because, you know, we may, in some cases and in some sites, you know, sometimes you start with a lot of wells and then you can narrow down to the ones that really matter. And so you have a long history of the site and you understand how the contamination goes. So it's not, you know, Linda is not looking at it and just throwing darts at the wall. It is a process where you know things about your site, you know things about sites in general and how they operate, and you use all of that experience and data to place your wells appropriately. And so, you know, I understand from a community perspective, it may look like the position of these wells is very random and the number is kind of, you know, arbitrary, but I assure you that's not the case. There's, you know, a lot of science behind some of these decisions that are made. Hopefully that makes you feel a little bit better about this, because I understand it can be a very complicated issue, but, you know, we don't make decisions just based on one data point or one, you know, line of evidence. There's usually multiple things that are pulled in for these.
Yes, and it does not make me feel better, and I'll tell you why. You heard you say, you said, so that we can talk about things with confidence. And for the last, I don't know, 3 years or however long the CAG's been in existence, I will have to say from my perspective, I have not heard anybody from the EPA or the WSDs or any of those sorts of folks really talk about this with confidence. It's, well, we got to have more data. We sampled that one and we sent stuff to a lab. None of that sounds very confident to me. I've never seen anything that says, well number X, Y, and Z was drilled here because, well number ABC was drilled over here because. So I don't know why the positions were selected. And I don't know if some of that has to do with whether you weren't allowed to drill in certain places, you didn't have enough money at one time. It just doesn't leave me with any confidence. I understand what you said, but it doesn't leave me with any confidence. But thank you for your explanation.
Yeah. This is John Barber. I'd like to chime in on that. I think if you go back to the history of the CAG and their relationship with the EPA and the work settling defendants, it never has been a relationship of trust. And from our perspective, we come to the table, and I shared this last time. We sat down and listened to a presentation over there at the Lowry Air Force Base and the contamination, all they had. And they answered every question that we could possibly have had. We didn't have to ask questions. But with this group, we drive the questions, but they never get answered. And so that's where the frustration lies for me, is that I'm looking at this plume, and it's the same thing I saw 3 years ago. The only difference is now you're saying, well, at that time you were diluting. Now you're not diluting, and now you're telling me that 0.9, we're good. Everything's fine. That's what you're saying. Look, all the wells are testing fine. Everything's fine. There's nothing to worry about. No concerns here. The plume hasn't grown. We're not sure about where it's at and so on, but you know, everything's good. Why do we even, what is there to be concerned about? And the problem is that we just don't trust what's coming from all of you, because the information is highly inconsistent, and it is there's distractions that put us off, and our questions never get answered, such as how far is the plume, how deep is the plume, how wide is the plume, what's in the plume. And all you say is, well, we have wells, 1,4-dioxane. If it's not above 0.9, we're happy. End of discussion. And we're like, what? And so it's like, that isn't what they were saying 3 years ago, and they were diluting then. So now we're getting all this other information, and it's very difficult to process that when, and then it's frustrating to me to hear you say, I'm a professional scientist, which the inference is, you know, John, just got to take my word for it because you really are not educated. Everything's fine. And that's hard for us to take in that process and over the 3 years. I know that's not a question, it's a statement, but hopefully that helps everybody on this call understand the frustration that we carry and the fear, or probably better stated, the concern that we have for the safety of our community. Because it just seems like we chase our tails and talk in circles. Thank you.
I have a question. I understand that MW38's got a narrow sand channel. I could be wrong, but that's kind of what I got gleaned out of what's been said. And up in Mississippi, these wells are 300 feet apart. Is that based on somebody's assumption that the sand channels are wide enough that those 300-foot well distances would catch it? To me, it seems to be too wide. In some other types of delineations in other plumes, they put us 100 feet apart to make sure that the contamination didn't slip through on a narrow channel. So that's my question.
So if I heard you correctly, you were asking about the well spacing along the Mississippi transect?
Correct.
Yeah. The reasoning behind the transects is that the data is telling us that there is a more permeable area that is traveling down here, which is where we've placed all the wells. And the sampling strategy included stringing monitoring wells across that more permeable channel until there are non-detects on either side. So this looked at the geology, but then also the water levels and the topography in that area, because, you know, obviously gravity works underground as well. And so when there is a groundwater gradient down there, you don't expect groundwater to be flowing against the gradient. So there were several reasons why those wells are placed where they are. And then the spacing, I think, is, you know, whether they're 100 feet apart or 300 feet apart, you know, the important point is bounding on the sides so that we have an idea of the boundaries of where the plume ends. So, and maybe Sarah can talk more about the strategies for the transects.
Sure, yeah. I wasn't gonna, I think it's, oh, sorry, go ahead, Richard.
Well, I was going to say, it seems to me that 300 feet apart, if there's a narrow sand channel like M38 and W38, you'd want to know if in fact the groundwater was flowing through there in a sand channel. Because looking at Murphy Creek and the two tributaries that go through there, they're not very far from the Mississippi.
Yeah, so just to back out the overall topic, I think the question is, and it's one that occurs at every site, how much delineation is enough? How much characterization is enough? When we're looking at the subsurface, being able to characterize even a very small area with a great amount of detail is pretty much impossible. So you do have to pull in these multiple lines of evidence regarding the way the sediments were deposited, the geologic history, what we know from the core logs, and what we're looking at in terms of contamination, and then use that information, combine it, and say, what questions do we need to answer, and what data do we need to collect to answer those questions? So as Diane was mentioning, north of the site, and this is also true of the MW38 sand channel area, we know that the contamination is traveling through the, primarily through the weathered material, and within that weathered material, the sand channels that provide a preferential flow path. We know the paleo channel, which means where Murphy Creek had been in geologic time before it appears exactly where it's traced on the surface now. That provided these sand pathways leading north out of the site. So in those transects, the goal is not, we need to pinpoint exactly where every part of this sand channel exists and then be able to characterize exactly what the water quality is at all of those locations. That was not the goal. The goal is we need to hit that sand channel where and preferably the center of it, take a representative sample of the water quality in those sands to be able to say, okay, this far north, if considering the contamination is traveling through these sands, this is a representative sample of what those concentrations look like once it reaches this area. And then because we know plume behavior, as you move out from that center of mass, the concentrations decrease. We're really looking, as Diane said, to bound those lower concentrations on either side. So the point is not to get a perfect profile of that sand channel and the concentrations all throughout. With this low of concentrations and the fact that this is representing groundwater that's not reaching any receptor, it's not reaching surface water at this surface water receptors or groundwater wells at these locations. And that conversation sort of ties back to Dave Barry's presentation. So that representative sample is enough for that. Now for both of these instances, MW38 channel and the north end plume, back towards the site where it's closer to the source, the landfill, the spacing of wells is far tighter. So it's a much clearer picture. And that's how we know as we step out and further away, that's how we know where to target that center of mass. So it's, I'm using hand gestures and they're all below my camera. So at the site boundary, we have a bunch of wells creating a tight picture, showing an issue here. So then we focus in here with a few, or a transect or a bunch, and then the density can decrease as we move further away. Concentrations are lower.
Is that on MW 142, you've got a well there, and then you go all the way up to MW 145, nothing between. So you're telling me that you all know that there's no problem between them because you haven't tested. You haven't even put down one well.
Well, I mean, that's a good example. So MW 141, between that and MW 145, that's where the concentrations go from, being around, this doesn't have the detections on it, but being above that 0.9 threshold to being below it. So, oh, there we go.
Well, I guess the problem is that we don't consider 0.9 relative. We consider the contamination of dioxane and other chemicals that came from the site that went up there. So
And,
if you stop at 0.9, maybe you don't have to drill any more wells. I don't know. If that's what Dave Berry says on his receptor thing, then I guess that kind of closes the issue.
And there always is sort of that awkward conversation or that awkward communication piece of the reality of delineating plumes is always, there is always a number associated with it, either non-detect, which for, you know, general understanding should be considered 0. And then the detection limit, and then standards. So there's always a number associated with how we communicate about it. It's never simply not there. We never say with complete certainty absent, because there is the reality of detection limits and laboratory methods, and it doesn't communicate that well. I definitely agree with that.
Well, I think if you say 0 and 0 is 0.9 and it's detected at 0.15, that's 0 to me. And so the word 0, I don't think works. Non-detect, yeah, you can say that's what the EPA determines it to be, non-detect, but they didn't look to see, or maybe they know it's 0.15, it is there.
I see what you're saying. And I get that perspective that 0.15 or 0.15, which is the method detection limit, right? And that's what, if you hear that in your mind that's what you want to hear. And the difference between having that conversation of why EPA is okay with 0.9, you know, that's a different topic. That's one we've explored in the past, and I think that we still have, you know, some difference of perspective on.
Thank you.
So let me interject here with regard to that, since we ended at that particular conversation on 0.9. Lowry Wright did interject and offer that analytical technology just isn't there yet for a lower number. I'm sure when a better method is found, the WSDs, EPA, CDPHE will adopt it. And then I'm going to queue up Dietrich, who has a question, and I want him to actually, Dr. McGinnis, to talk about it, and because if he has to clarify or wants to continue the conversation. Dietrich?
Yes, thank you. Can I put this up on the chat just because it was a relatively simple question? When can we see this type of plume delineation figure provided that's at 0.35?
It's
I'm sorry.
At regulatory level.
What's that?
If you can repeat it, and we're having a little trouble hearing you, Dietrich. My apologies. My office PC is at IT dead on arrival, so I'm kind of jury-rigged today. Can we see an estimate of the plume, a figure like this, that is based on 0.35, the state groundwater standard, as opposed, I believe this one's at 0.9? Is that something that can be generated for us?
No, the simple reason is while we got a beetle here. Excellent. You want to put it outside? Because while the WSDs will report down to the method detection, you can go through the dog door.
Right here.
Taking that data below the performance standard and then creating an image with it would not satisfy the QA, QC measures and data quality metrics that EPA would use to create an actual image for communication.
Well, and I would point out that that data is depicted on the maps. I mean, so for example, right here for MW176, it does show a concentration of 0.56, but it has the data qualifier of J, which means that it was detected between the method detection limit and the reporting limit of 0.9. And so there's some uncertainty there. Again, this kind of goes back to a greater discussion on the reporting limits and what that means statistically and why they're important, which could be an entirely different topic. But when I talk about confidence, I mean statistical confidence. So, we look at the method detection limit, the laboratory analytical methods, and there's statistical limits where this is the level that you have confidence that it is, I guess, a real concentration. And so it's not possible to see zero. It's just not, because you never really know what you can't see. So that's the way, we depict the uncertainty of not knowing if it's zero or if it's 0.15 or if it's 0.9. So that 0.9 indicates a statistical confidence that we can see regularly from the laboratory.
I'm a little confused because you are reporting, as you just said, you are actually showing on this figure values under 0.9.
Exactly, yeah. So,
and
when...
It seems counterproductive to not include that in a more widespread discussion of plume. And I mean, I understand that there is a regulatory nuance to this and what figures are produced. But during, say, a discussion of assessment, it would seem to be more important to stretch those limits a little bit. It's been my experience that these figures can be very useful to determine how well that regulatory figure, in this case the 0.91, jives with the data that's being produced. And second, we already know there's a potential for another source within this plume, and that kind of figure, that kind of visual can be very important in discerning it.
It wouldn't be technically correct to use that data the way you're describing. The laboratory puts that J qualification on it as estimated because there is a question of the confidence level in that number. So that is an industry standard. That is every site that we work on. There is a method detection limit. There's just a reporting limit qualification that each laboratory certifies that this is the level that we can say with confidence that we can detect. And anything below that, they have to put a lab qualifier on it. And these are things like, in order for the lab to be certified with EPA, they have to go through these methods and quantify their confidence levels. And a lot of them, like in California, they have to do it every year to get recertified. So these are not, like a site-specific decision that we make. This is all sites have a reporting limit.
Okay, I don't really want to go through the nuances of environmental and laboratory quality assurance. I think that if the moment that you're willing to put that number on a figure, then that discussion's opened up. I also am a little concerned about even just the higher reporting limits this site sees compared to ones even regionally, even ones in the same watershed that are faced with the same water quality issues. I'm not sure we're going to answer the question now, other than I would leave a pin in this and say it might be useful to stretch this out a little bit since the data is already shown on the figure. And I have a second question, if you'll humor me. And if you'll roll the figure a little bit up so we can see a little bit more to the south.
Is that good?
Not that far, please. And a little bit more. I want to show the figure to the north there, and maybe scroll just a little bit more. Yeah, right in there. And this is something we see when we do have some features to follow. And I just want to point this out. If there's a response that's needed, you can give it. You'll notice that these 4 wells are all in a row. They don't really assess to the east or the west. Now, and let's keep in mind that the topography of a region is often indicative of groundwater flow, but it is not definitive of groundwater flow, particularly in a channelized system like this one. So my point is, though, these wells were all drilled right in this nice little row. When your wells are drilled in a row like that, you will not generate data that shows your plume not following the wells. And this is a considerable distance, isn't it? It's like a half a mile or so. These are big blocks, right? Or is it more than that? So we have this distance between 141 up to the one right there, and I can't read the number on it, I apologize, the one north of 144. That doesn't give us any real east-west on the plume, and in fact, it's really a hit and a miss, and that's where the plume's gonna go. So this doesn't yield us any information on what could be moving on either side of this plume. It's almost like these wells were drilled with a predetermined pathway for the plume. And I'm just I think a lot of questions you're getting from the public when they look at this and their own concern about your data density in that area. It's more than just someone who's lived in that area, experienced with what's going on, and attended a lot of these meetings. So they're probably, they definitely, I think a lot of folks listening today have a better than a layman's knowledge of
It wouldn't let me in.
this
Epic
kind of thing.
fail.
But that still is kind of telling. So I'll leave that there and let you guys respond to that.
Sarah, do you want to take this one about the topography and the groundwater flow in this area?
Can you sort of distill the question? I mean, I know you centered around the issue of the transects and the density being low. I think we already spoke to that. So I didn't quite hear what the question is.
Well, there's no sensitivity to the system to determine what the potential for flow to the east or west from these wells. They're drilled in a line. You either find it or you're not, so that it forces your plume map into that line.
Okay, yeah, so it's sort of questioning that step out transect methodology in general, which is very common.
No, I'm not. I'm not questioning a step out transect because that is an industry standard.
Yeah.
I see an assumption as this stepped out that the plume would be this shape when there can be an assumption of direction to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
But think about it. It's either going to be where you put the well or not where you put the well. A step out, you have to deal with the dimensions that it can go. East, west, north, south, downward, upward, whatever the situation may do. But this one, just between the well spacing and the other ones, I think some of the residents have some very legitimate concerns and questions. And I'm waiting to hear that you had some boundary to the east and the west that you were dealing with.
So Sarah, if I may interject, this is Tim Shangra. Dietrich, I think it's really important to look at the transect on East Mississippi and the density of east-west wells along that transect.
Mm.
I also think if you go down to the south, we've got another transect, keep going south, right here, that shows the density of wells in that area. And what that transect, and as well, you get another one down at Yale. And we've got very good definition of how wide that plume is. And what we're basically saying with the monitoring within the 140, 141, 144, all the way up into Mississippi is that we have a relatively narrow plume. It's consistent with the topography. So like Diane and Sarah were saying, we use other lines of evidence that in fact are confirmed when we do a detailed transect. So to say that while we're shooting in the dark, we're just assuming that the groundwater is flowing north-south, and it be just only because we have lines on wells on a line is technically inaccurate.
And I guess the place that really starts staying, if you want to go all the way south to the Superfund site boundary.
Right.
Oh, well, this map doesn't show it, but at the site boundary, the density of wells is very high. And so it sort of narrows in where we start from, where we start stepping out the transects from.
Right. And Sarah, to that point, I mean, look at all the transects we have. You get the 180, what we call the T1 transect. We've got another transect where we have the MW150 series wells. We have another transect at Yale. We have another transect at the 133 series wells. I mean, I think you've got a very good line of evidence to say the plume is relatively narrow and it follows the water course of this drainage to the west of the main stem of Murphy Creek.
And there's one other sort of piece of information, because there always are going to be unknowns surrounding this. So if you do believe that maybe there's a paleo channel that's been missed, it's certainly not the main one. This is the paleo channel that leads from the center of on-site contamination. It leads directly north of the site along groundwater flow. So if you believe that potentially there is something missed here, it's not going to present more risk than what this channel does. So, you know, based on the density of wells at the site, north of the site, we believe that there's a high degree of certainty that this is the pathway of migration off site, and that these are the concentrations that are present. However, if you did go down sort of a thought experiment or let yourself, you know, really sort of imagine that maybe something else there's an excursion somewhere else, it's not going to be more significant than this one. It would be I could say with complete certainty, my professional judgment of the geology, groundwater flow, and then the concentrations in this area, this would be the primary mode of transport or pathway of transport.
So for a braided channel, you are assuming that over this distance, you have a single channel of defined.
Can't hear you, Dietrich.
Dietrich, you're faded.
So can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So you're assuming for this distance and this channel and this braided system that you're on the main channel, that it doesn't have other channels related to it that would be of concern. And that the distance between your site, east-west transects, and then the next one you do, which is quite a ways away, is adequate to show that.
Yes, and I mean, I don't think that there's not space for braiding within this plume delineation. If you sort of look at the surface trace of the current Murphy Creek, I mean, I don't think we're looking at a major river here. We're looking at a small drainage, and
well, and
not
I guess
the braided river system is inapplicable.
Yeah. The second thing is, you have discussed that y'all believe that the principal release is in the past. And I'll remind you that would mean that the centroid of the plume may also be past the highest density of your monitoring system close to the site. So a continuous release or a recent release would follow the definition of a decreasing gradient with distance. But a historical release would not. So I mean, it seems a little like we're getting contradictory statements when we talk about this. And then there's the other thing that I think I can concur with USGS when they looked at this data a while back, as well as the hydrologist I've had working on it. Geophysics would answer a lot of these questions a little more definitively, and by the way, at a pretty low cost. And I'm always curious why that wasn't done.
I think that the geophysics topic might be more than worth diving into right now, and we might want additional resources to support that conversation. However, I just wanted to note sort of your point about plume stability or plume trends and changes through time. I fully agree that that remains a question, and that's why we have continued monitoring planned for these wells post cessation, so that we can look at what the concentrations do over time, see, and I think that's going to provide a lot of information. It's just not going to do it quickly.
Yeah, I'd love to continue this discussion, but I think I've made my point, and I don't want to prevent other people that have questions from having an opportunity.
Should we move on to question 12.2? So as you can see,
This is, excuse me, Diane, this is Bruce. I just wanted to add one more thing on that, and I don't want to belabor it. But the 0.9 is described in the PQL studies and the reports, and the statistics and the math there, which is done and presented and independent and based on the groundwater at the site with the associated matrix interferences that are going to be found at the site, is the reason there's a 0.9. And I would urge you to go back and look at that. A lot of technical detail. You don't have to trust my word on it or anything else, but look at that information. That's why there's a 0.9.
I want to be sure to queue up Bonnie Rader. She's next. She's got some questions.
Yes, I do. Bruce, I understand what you're saying, and I know you're correct. I'm not questioning your ability as a technical person, but I guess we forgot that Richard was asked at the last meeting to bring up what's happening with the dewatering process through the water quality people, and how there are some sites that are saying that they're using 0.9 because EPA approved the Lowry landfill. And this, to me, Richard was prepared to give his presentation tonight at the request of some of the people from Murphy Creek. And he wanted to discuss that. We understand how these issues can be turned around because people don't want to have to meet the requirement of 0.35. And however, we find that Lowry Landfill Superfund site is one of the few sites where this is going on. You have Buckley Air Force Base, their proposals definitely are sticking to 0.35.
That's simply not true. I know the Rocky Mountain Arsenal was at 1, for instance. Me? I know that Rocky Mountain Arsenal, we've been looking at groundwater at Rocky Mountain Arsenal, and it's a 1 part per billion.
Okay, but that's
not their analytical work, they can't get down that low. I'm not talking about what everybody else is doing. I'm just simply adding to Dietrich's comment about the 0.35, that the driver here is 0.9. And that's simply for the work that's being done at the Lowry landfill site. And that's it. It's not about who else is at the development or who else is doing anything else because they overheard something. That's completely out of the purview of what I was talking about.
Okay, Bruce,
Dietrich, with all due respect, I disagree with the fact that he's trying to say we can map this thing out to a 0.35, and he's in those contexts of that plume and those transects, he's right. You can't really do it because the data's right there. Well, make your own map. You can put the pencil to paper and put 0.35 on it. He knows that's technically indefensible, and we do as well.
Who are you saying knows that's
Dietrich.
indefensible? Okay, Bruce, that's fine. I don't know what you were saying a minute ago, but it is not true that Buckley is using 0.35. And it is important to us on this CAG who are living with this.
I didn't say Buckley. I said Rocky Mountain Arsenal.
I know, but you ran your sentence together, Bruce, and you said that's technically untrue, and it is not. Buckley, Kim Sales are going at 0.35.
That's fine. That's 0.35. I'm not talking about. I'm talking about my experience. I'm not talking about Buckley. I don't look at Buckley.
That's good. And I have all the respect in the world for you, Bruce, okay? I do. But I'm not going to argue this point with you just because you believe you've done the right thing at Lowry Landfill. Because what I wanted
I
to point
didn't
out.
say I did the right thing at Lowry Landfill. I said we did 2 PQL studies, and the information is there that supports the point.
Okay,
that's it.
I understand that, and we can move further along with this. I would like to make my point here now, if you don't mind. Thank you. Our point is that if other sites are doing it, there's got to be a way, and if the state and the feds have set a specific standard, and the labs that we have talked with and that are doing work out there in the field are able to get below 0.35, we're finding it difficult. Those of us that are living with a plume coming through our neighborhoods, we're having trouble going along with the reasoning at Lowry. Now, if we can be taught more, we'll be happy to. There's no problem with that. However, it doesn't make sense to us at this point in time because I'm sure Buckley has some issues up there that interfere with their ability to get down lower too. But in the meantime, I would like to just point out that what we're hearing a lot of today, and we've heard a lot of for the past 40 years, is that in your professional opinion, and we have this belief, and what you're not hearing from the community is we know we have a plume going through neighborhoods. We know that we feel threatened by it, and we also know that we're very concerned about the fact that we're not injecting potable water anymore. So God knows what's going to happen with those chemicals now. So we're very concerned about how well this study has been going on. And earlier we were talking about wells that had been installed and they were done very well, and you know why they're put there. But I would like to remind you too, and this is not patently untrue, there have been many times at this site when wells were drilled and the contractors or EMSI didn't like what showed up in that well, and so they would move over and find a clean well to use. And that's very disconcerting to us that live by this site. And so what I'm saying to you is I understand what you're saying. I do not agree that you can't do it down to 0.35 because there's plenty of labs out there nowadays that are doing it. And we just believe that's in our better favor. That's really where I wanted to go with this. And secondly, Richard has been doing his research, and we are shocked that just because EPA said that at Lowry Landfill you can use 0.9, they're allowing the dewatering process to go through at 0.9. We don't think that's right. For instance, they're drilling to do a new sewer line from Buckley, and over there, they're running into water. So when they check dewatering, we want to be sure if the plume from Lowry has gone that far, that they check down to 0.35 at least. And I don't think that's unwise.
So, Lori, this is Linda Kiefer. Lori, for the people on the call who don't understand what matrix interference is and how that can affect how low test method can detect down to, can you explain what matrix interference is, and also how our hard water in Colorado does contribute to that?
Of course, Linda. Thank you very much for recognizing me. I did give a presentation to the CAG, maybe, was it a year ago or 2 years ago, trying to demonstrate how matrix interference can interfere with you trying to find one chemical in a big plume of other things. I would also like to say I did manage the state of Colorado's laboratory for 13 years. We worked really hard to try to get a low-level 1,4-dioxane analysis going. The best our lab could do, and this is your state laboratory at work for you, was 1 part per billion. So with that, Colorado groundwaters are notorious for having a bunch of calcium and iron in the water, and those cause interferences. Calcium loves to combine with all sorts of organic chemicals, making kind of like a, I don't know how to explain it, like a precipitate. And so what we've done through the years when I've been working with PWT is we have gone through these PQL investigations, trying to find laboratories. We've investigated all of those methods where everyone says, oh, you know, EPA method 522 for drinking water can get a much lower limit. We've looked at those. And then we also looked into the statistics they use to calculate their detection limits, which do not follow the typical MDL kind of determination. So I'm just saying every site is different. That's why CDPHE had a whole community of industrial people, lawyers, environmental folks that sat in on the PQL subcommittee for several years trying to define how to provide a PQL for the public that's going to be defensive. There is a flow chart with over, I think, 27 nodes on it. And they have used this PQL process, and they do allow for a site-specific PQL because of different interferences. So at each site, Buckley Air Force Base is going to be much different than a landfill. Yes, they might have had pits. I'm not familiar with the site and what their contaminants are, but each one of those adds to the uncertainty that you can detect one compound out of several. Hey, it's just me being a chemist.
We love chemists.
Thank you. 2 thumbs up. Wish I had one. 3 kids, none of them went into science.
Oh.
I got a quick question. I understand, Linda, that you worked your butt off with other people trying to get a way to detect lower than whatever they were detecting. I don't know how long ago that was. But the thing is out of all the discussions and all the panels and all that to try to determine the PQL, why did the state red 41 set 0.35? Why would they do that if they didn't believe anybody could detect it? That makes sense.
They can test down to that level in treated drinking water supply.
Right, and then the water quality standards were updated with the option of a site-specific standard based on technology available and the economics of getting there. So, you know, they update those regularly based on input and criteria from different parties. And like chem sales, compared to Lowry Landfill, chem sales is more of a drinking water supply area. So I imagine their water's not as hard as it is out by Lowry Landfill.
This is Tom Kraus. I'm sorry I couldn't get in any other way because I couldn't get in the chat. If the matrix interference at the landfill site is such that they can't do it, does that same matrix interference apply when you're all the way up to Jewel Avenue and one of your plume maps shows that the width goes into where they have the townhomes? And so maybe you need to relook at what matrix interference is up there. That's an awful long way from where you did your studies. The other is that at MW 141 WD on Jewel Avenue, you did not do a transect, and yet that's the area where there's houses on either side. And I'm wondering if a transect should be considered there, because where you've done transects further to the south, you've made the plume much wider. I know that north of there, the plume is not wider. So I'd like to ask that you consider those things.
Tom, this is Lowry Wright again, the chemist. I just wanted to let you know, as the matrix studies were performed on background wells. So this is groundwater coming into the system, into the area. And it was found to have very high mineral content, very high metals content. And so that is where the matrix interference study was done to determine the practical, or what we call the practical quantitation limit.
Okay, so you're saying that even though you're far closer to Buckley at that point, you don't need to redo it in those wells that are, say, in either Thunderbird Estates or Gun Club Estates to see whether the PQL should be lower.
Sir,
This conversation, I think, let's get some perspective from the state too. I think Colleen can shed some light on the background of the standard versus the PQL under the water quality regulation. Colleen?
Thanks, Janine. So I wanted to answer Richard's questions. Why does water quality set the standard at 0.35 if they allow a PQL of something higher than that? And that is a very typical thing the Water Quality Commission does. They set the standards based on health-based information, regardless of whether or not you can actually detect to that standard. And they recognize that in a lot of cases, you cannot detect to their health-based standard. So what they have done, and this is something that Lowry Wright was talking about, they have put together a PQL policy that they use throughout the state to determine what the PQL is for contaminants that you cannot detect down to their standard for. And for 1,4-dioxane, the Water Quality Control Division's PQL standard in their policy is 3.2. Obviously, that's a lot higher than any of us are comfortable with. And so for site-specific standards, then they do look at the matrix interference at a particular site and try to look for a lower PQL at a site-specific level. But the 0.35, they understood when they put that in that it was probably not detectable at most sites, depending on what the groundwater was looking like. And that's really more based on a drinking water, a clean drinking water sample.
Does that help? Also, Dietrich has a little more he'd like to bring to the conversation.
Yeah, and I appreciate some of the input coming into this. I didn't realize we had other state lab veterans out there. I was at the Mississippi State Chemical Labs for a while. It was a great experience. But I think we've got a couple of factors here that need to be considered. The first one is that other sites with a lot of these matrix interferences are currently meeting these lower detection limits. And Buckley is a great example because it's in the same watershed faced with many of the same matrix issues. And they are plotting out their 1,4-dioxane maps at 0.35. They're able to do it. Now, the groundwater closer to the site may very well have matrix interferences that are particularly challenging here, particularly if it's laden with other contaminants of concern. But as we get out closer to East Mississippi, where we do have currently existing wells and that kind of thing, I think it's very well that we may need to look at adapting to that changing water type and perhaps entertaining a PQL that's set for that area. And this isn't that unusual for a site this large, where we already have acknowledged in some of the stuff that Sarah Tesh put together, we have more than one water type to manage out there. And those differences in water type may allow us to take a look at lower PQLs at that more important, where we run into the human plume interface part of the site. And so that would be my suggestion to the technical folks here, is to have a discussion on and see if there is a way to get those lower PQLs and to utilize them as we move north of the site, and perhaps encounter water quality that mix with the newer methods and more recent developments in these methodologies to achieve these lower standards.
So just a clarification on that. In the North End report, there was a lot of discussion about water quality types. And just so everybody is clear, the water quality type in the weathered Dawson is a calcium sulfate type, and it does not change from the site to as far north as Mississippi. So, we can't really base an argument on reevaluating the PQL based on change in water quality, because water quality type, because it does not change.
I do think we see some degree of less complicated analysis for what dioxane as we move away from the site, just by the absence of other COCs. Whether or not that's achieved by a lower calcium level or not, I think that's another discussion. But I think we hear residents of the area very concerned about this data being presented above the standard. And perhaps it is something to be entertained where we have an opportunity to achieve those lower standards or the potential for it, that it should be explored.
So David Barry, are you in the line?
Yes, I am.
So, so it's my understanding the 0.9 equates to a risk of 2 times 10 to the -6, which.
That's correct.
So it's still at the very, very bottom of the acceptable risk range. So even though, can you talk about the PQL and then like how the risk assessment, are they related? Are they not related? Like just some clarity on that.
Well, I think the other issue that people should understand is that this shallow aquifer is not currently used as a potable water source, number one. And number two, the city of Aurora has an ordinance that prevents people from putting wells for private drinking water in this area. So the concentrations that we have out there are low levels, and as the plume moves further north, they're obviously decreasing. And the concentrations equate to, levels that are within EPA's risk management range of 1 times 10 to the -6 to 1 times 10 to the -4. And with the fact that no one's drinking the water, these are monitoring wells, they're not potable wells. I think the issue is not an issue. The water is not reaching human receptors.
And then we have Tom Simmons online, and he's the toxicologist for CDPHE. Did you have anything that you would like to add?
No, I don't think so. I think that information is accurate.
I was under this is Dietrich. I was under the understanding that not all of this plume area was in the city of Aurora. Some of it was outside of the city of Aurora, where.
Who's talking? Is that Dietrich? Can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, as I said, this is Dietrich, and it's my understanding that a portion of this plume is outside of the city of Aurora, and unless the state engineer has an administrative obligation to not permit a well application, the water can be used for domestic use, or an existing water right can be moved to it. So I kind of fall back to that. And maybe this is an idea to have somebody from the state engineer's office speak to this effect, because if we're going to disassociate the groundwater from actual water use that far, usually I would see some type of covenant associated with the actual deed or title to the land.
So Dietrich, in the emails that Lisa sent out in the last week, there were some links to documents on tech memos looking at wells in the footprint or near the footprint, that, and some are in Arapahoe County and not City of Aurora. So if you want to look at there's two memos, June 1st and June 3rd. So there's links to those. If you want a copy of the ordinance too. So we looked at those wells. They were abandoned or sampled. We have not found any 1,4-dioxane in any of the private wells on Jewel. So you can look at those reports.
I'm not sure that is answering the question I'm asking. Is EPA or the work settling defendants taking an action to permanently remove water rights or water use from the unincorporated areas that don't have existing moratoriums or other rules that would restrict that use?
So like I said, those wells are either abandoned, which means they're plugged, or they're active in Arapahoe County and they're permitted and they're sampled. So there is no
do I need to repeat the point? Are you removing the rights of folks to install wells on their property?
It would be illegal for us to do that because we do not have unacceptable risks to anyone. So that it would not be lawful for us to do that.
So therefore, don't we have to make an assumption that since folks have a right to use this water for drinking water and own that property, and then act accordingly? I'm a little confused because at other sites, this would bring the house down if property owners thought somebody was coming after their water rights, or they were restricted their use of their water rights because of water quality that wasn't their fault. And I also know that this plume, we all know, is very close to an area where a lot of people use their groundwater rights. So it seems to me we are getting a little off track of where the discussion needs to be.
Right, because
I'm kind of diluting it with
know exactly what you're talking about.
So there's parcels of property I could buy in this plume and put a well in.
No, you in Colorado, you have to go through the state engineer law and you have to follow local ordinances and local laws. So people can't just drop a well in Colorado.
Yeah, I have to say, especially if it's a tributary water supply or if it's a tributary aquifer, then you need surface water rights, Dietrich.
Well, excuse me, this is Bonnie. I have to add in here. I personally know of very deep wells and shallow wells that are not registered with the state engineer. There's many people that drill their own wells and they do their own thing. And I know personally one well that's clear down into the Arapahoe. It's never been registered, state doesn't know anything about it. So to talk like the county or the state is regulating these wells is not true.
Well, to Dietrich's question, can anybody just poke a well in this contaminated groundwater and pump a well? The answer is no.
Legally.
You need to have a surface water right to do that.
Okay, I'm not saying that somebody
Yes, you do.
Put a well wherever they want. What I'm saying is, have you taken the administrative action that someone pursuing the normal legal channels that has a right to the water, because there's nothing here that says there's not water rights remaining, or that can be moved to this area and put a well in? This is so typical of these sites. I'm surprised we don't have something to this effect in one of these documents I'm looking at. And I think maybe what we need to do is have somebody from the state engineer's office come talk to the group.
Well,
the city of Aurora owns all the water rights underneath the Murphy Creek subdivision.
Okay, but that's not the entirety of the property where the plume lies.
So we have Sean from Aurora Water on the call. Sean, is there some information you can contribute to this conversation from the city of Aurora's perspective?
I mean, from our perspective, and I think this may have been a question last time, you know, if people, you know, move into the city and are looking to, you know, get a water supply, their water supply has to be provided by the city of Aurora, so by the water department. They are not allowed to drill wells for water supply. They're independent water systems, and that includes individuals are not allowed within the borders of the city of Aurora. Although what I hear Dietrich saying perhaps is that he believes that some of this plume is not within the city of Aurora and our legal boundaries, and therefore are there other protections outside of the city of Aurora that would limit that? And I don't know the answer to that.
Right. And so in the tech memos I mentioned that from June, you know, those wells that are in incorporated Arapahoe County, you know, were inspected and discussed in those memos. So they're available on our website.
But Linda, I don't think he's talking about existing wells. He's talking if somebody were to come in to an unincorporated Arapahoe County parcel, purchase land and drill a well, is there anything preventing them from doing that?
I guess that's a state engineer question.
Yeah, that's a complicated question. And we could talk about tributary wells, non-tributary wells. To just say that that could happen is a big stretch.
I think one thing that is a pretty reliable stop of it is that a well drilling contractor would never drill a well without having that permit in hand before starting. They won't even test them.
You don't know that to be a fact because we know for a fact a well drilling company who we know went in and drilled that well to the Arapahoe, and he got paid very well. And we know that because they were trying to bring it into a well adjudication that Bonnie put forth for the people that live around there.
Listen, there's nothing that could prevent crime.
Right.
Okay.
And so as a former realtor in Colorado, if you have an illegal well on a property, it can make it difficult to sell that property.
I think we need to be careful because I think we're getting away from the point, which is that has this right been removed from the property? I am making no assumption of an illegal installation of a well, simply pointing out, you know, it's my understanding that until the state engineer has an administrative obligation to not permit the well, then they can pursue the appropriate method to install it. And that's actually, it's true for Colorado as it is in Nevada and many Western states. And as long as that right is there on some of those parcels, we have to consider that groundwater be used. And that's typical for Superfund sites. All the ones I work at, if that water remains within the purview where it can be used for domestic use, then that's how we treat it. And I think that the best suggestion we had was, let's talk to the state engineer. Let's get this cleared up. Let's look at a map, what parcels we're talking about, and get it cleared up. And then we can make the appropriate decisions going forward.
Right. So check out those reports. They're on our website, June 1st and July 3rd.
We have a question from Margie Sobey, CAG member.
Oh, well, it was kind of from a long time ago, and it was really just a comment. And we've kind of gotten away from the topic, but it was the standard being different for this site and the state. And the only comment I want to make is I heard a lot of technical discussion here tonight about that, and some of the discussion I had never heard before. What I remember hearing about the reason that the Lowry site has a higher standard than the state is because it was able to negotiate that. And so that's what I've been carrying around for several years, is that my health was negotiated away. And that's what irritates me about the difference in the standard. Thanks.
I'm really not sure where the negotiated part came from. It came through scientific methodology, doing a practical quantitation limit study. And several have been done. In fact, there was another one done in 2019 in December. So it's a scientific determination, not.
Yeah, and in due respect to you, Linda, this negotiation comment was made before you took over the site. So you would not have heard it, but that's what was said. And I've been carrying that around thinking, oh my gosh, they were allowed to negotiate away my health.
Margie, one important point is that I think is important to make is that your health is not being impacted. All of the characterization, all of the data indicate that you are not being exposed.
Well, that's good for you to say, but I live there and I, at this point, do not have the confidence that you do that says my health is not being impacted.
Yeah, this is Richard. I got a question about the process that Region 8 goes through on the Lowry landfill on a yearly basis. I guess maybe the ROD requires it or whatever, that they look at that. But it was my understanding that even when they look at that and come to a determination and go through an AC process, bottom line is if the state has a regulation in place, they cannot, the EPA cannot just change it to a different standard. So I could be wrong because I'm not very smart at this. If you start reading about these things, read what the EPA has to say about state standards, and it's really confusing. So I could be clear off the ball.
So Tim Shanger, can you explain a little bit about the criteria for performance standards and how it was set forth in the ROD and how, you know, they're adjusted
Sure.
as new information comes along from time to time in the groundwater monitoring plan?
Sure. So Richard, you're absolutely right. You start off with the Colorado state standards. And then from there, if you look at metals, then you look at background. And if a background metals concentration is higher than the state standard, then the background concentration becomes the standard. Make sense? And then the same thing applies, or similar thing applies to an analytical method. And you know, I don't want to repeat the the whole discussion about 1,4-dioxane, but the state standard is based on a clean drinking water source of water without matrix interference. But the state standard says you can adjust it to a site-specific standard based on an MDL study. And that's exactly what the Lowry landfill WSDs did. So then that becomes the standard.
So that's a state statement.
That's correct. That's
not
correct.
a federal statement.
That's correct.
That's state saying that.
The state says that you can have site-specific standards. That's correct.
So I guess what we're saying is, and I didn't realize it, that the state has changed that standard at the Lowry landfill area.
There's a narrative standard associated with 1,4-dioxane. The base standard is 0.35, but the narrative standard is if you can't meet that, or if you have groundwater, say, that has interference like Lowry's does, you can do an MDL study and come up with a site-specific standard.
And that site-specific standard, does that have to be approved by EPA, not Region 8, but the higher-ups at EPA? Or can they just accept that and say, that's what it is, that's what they did?
You say they being EPA?
Yeah, Region 8.
Yes,
When
that's
they
correct.
came up with-
That's correct.
Came up with a 0.9.
That's correct. But I don't think EPA did that in a vacuum. I think EPA consulted with CDPHE on the MDL studies.
Okay, so from what I'm hearing is that the state agreed with the 0.9.
That is
Therefore,
correct.
it can be 0.9, and the EPA Region 8 doesn't have to go anywhere else with that to use it or use that as a standard. I guess.
As long as we have the appropriate studies behind it that we feel are valid, you know, to back it up.
Yeah.
So that's what we evaluated EPA.
Okay, so the we determines, the we studies, the we determines what they're going to do, and the we does it. That's what you're saying. In in concert with the state. It doesn't go any farther than what Region 8 wants to do and does in all that.
Right. I mean, it'll come to the project manager and then I'll review it. Then I'll have technical experts at EPA review it too, make sure it meets the quality objectives, that's a valid study. And then if it is, and it's acceptable, then we share it with the state, have them review it, see if they feel the same way. So there's a process to it.
Okay, and then you make the final decision?
Yes, as a project manager.
Yes, thank you.
Wow.
So I wanted to do a time check. It's 6:07, and do we want to get back to, I believe we were, Diane, on 12. Were we still on 12?
I think 12.2.
12.2.
Yeah, I guess all of those questions were associated with 12.1, I believe.
Okay. So I realize it's a robust discussion. We can continue it, but I just wanted to check in. Are folks wanting to get back to the questions the CAG sent out so we can try to respond to those? Objective, object, no? Okay. All right, so let's get back to 12.2 then.
Okay. And the first question was about the shift between the Dawson Formation and the Denver Formation. And you can see that on this regional map. The purple is Dawson. And this is like the superficial formation. So this is the formation that's at the surface. And because...
Share. I don't think we can see that.
Oh, did I stop sharing? I did stop sharing. How did that happen?
I stopped you from sharing because it was a map and it was interfering with people seeing each other talking.
Oh, okay. Okay,
So now,
that makes sense. Sorry. Now, is that good? Yeah. So we're talking about the formation that's at the surface, and because Lowry Landfill is, the elevation changes from the south to the north, it does change from the Dawson Formation to the Denver Formation. So you can see the site is right here at the shift. And these are regional maps that are, not precise. I mean, it's kind of like looking at, like, are you in a temporal zone versus a desert zone? There's not a distinct line of when you change environments. It is kind of a broader context here. And you can see in the cross section here, Lowry Landfill's right here. And because this topography is exaggerated, but you can see that we're right here on the shift. But the point of that is that there's no material difference between when you are in the Dawson Formation and when you're in the Denver Formation. I mean, it's kind of like, I'm in Aurora. No, I'm in, not Aurora. I mean, it's not a bright line in the sand. And so, as a geologist looking at it, Sarah wouldn't take a sample and say, oh, this is Denver and this is Dawson. For this site, they would look the same because it's a gradual shift. I don't know how much more to say about that if anybody has any questions. The lignite layer, the question is, where does the lignite layer lose its integrity or cease to exist and provide a pathway for contaminants to travel deeper? I think first we should specify that contaminants aren't traveling deeper or not traveling deeper because of a lignite or the absence of a lignite. The contamination is up in the weathered formation and may extend slightly into the unweathered formation, but it seems like that shift in lithology is really the largest barrier to vertical flow. And I can show you some figures that illustrate that. And the difference between like a sandy clay or a sandy material and a clay material, those types of changes in the geology seem to be controlling the vertical formation, not necessarily the lignite, because the lignite is pretty deep. In our plume, we haven't shown any evidence that the plume is that deep that it would actually hit the lignite layer. Although we did find additional information when we did the 3D VA, when we looked at all of the soil borings, and I know this is difficult to see, but this is a 3D visualization of the unweathered lithology. So the weathered lithology is the top stuff, and that is where most of the flow is going and where the plume is. When you get into the unweathered lithology, it's much harder for groundwater to flow through it. It's claystone, sandstone, and then the lignite is the bottommost layer that we're talking about. The RI described the lignite layer as a continuous layer and used that as kind of the vertical boundary of the Superfund site. When we look at it again and plot it in 3 dimensions, it doesn't appear to be continuous. There are some, here I'll try to zoom in a little bit. And this is easier to see in like a rotatable 3-dimensional thing, but that's really hard to present over the phone. So, so these are the deeper soil borings, and this is the south of the site and then going north. So this is the far south reach of section 6. And this is where we had the highest density of soil borings that went deep enough and contacted the lignite layer. And you can see, like in this one, there's different lignite layers detected within the boring, and then this one, it's only down here. And then there's gaps in it. And so it doesn't appear to be a continuous layer like the RI had stated. As we go farther north, we don't have the density of data, so we can't make too many conclusions in this area because the soil borings just did not go deep enough and they did not contact lignite. So there's an absence there. But I know, and Sarah can speak to this a little bit more, she did look at some of the really deep wells that are north of this area, and they did contact lignite. But when she compared the elevations to what we're seeing here in section 6 versus what we're seeing far north, there didn't seem to be a continuity in the elevation or the depth between those portions. So the data that we're looking at shows that it doesn't seem to be a continuous layer. But again, it doesn't seem to impact groundwater flow vertically because it's just so deep, and that there are other barriers that slow down the vertical flow before it even gets to lignite. Have the sand lenses been defined in 3 dimensions? Yes.
Diane, before you get to that, I think Bonnie had a question about this segment.
I did.
Sure.
Thank you, Diane. These are all, I'm really appreciating this, but one thing I'd like to know if you can help us understand is where on these various sections does this Dawson ending and Denver take precedent, the top aquifer, where on these maps does this happen?
This is farther up here. So this is still section 6. Let me back up to a different, hold on, I have to find the correct one. Here, let's go back to these gap ones.
Okay.
So they think that it transitions more around here, around the north boundary barrier wall. And maybe Sarah, you can talk a little bit more on why they think that there's a transition between section 6 and section 31, but it seems like it's right around that section line.
Actually, I'd punt that to Tim Shangraw. I'm picturing that or I don't actually know where it came from, the GIS layer that you guys found and stuck on one of the maps quite a while ago of the surface trace of the contact.
Yeah, it was further north. Steve Fundingsland, are you on the phone? Evidently not, but my recollection was that the trace was north of section 31 into section 30.
Oh, so it was up here more?
Right.
That's my recollection too. Not that, it's an exact thing.
Okay, sorry, I was incorrect then. I was at the wrong section line. Okay. Yeah, let's go to, this was the one I was looking for. So back to the question about, where the sand channels delineate in 3 dimensions. So this is a figure from the 3DVA evaluation, the 3-dimensional data visualization and analysis that we did like a year or so ago. And this included many, I'll show you the number of boreholes. So the yellow and pink are all of the soil borings that were used in order to create the visualization of the geology, the more permeable lithology. So you can see we have good coverage. We even have borings that were in this area of the closed landfill cell because they were advanced before the waste was placed in this area. So we do have geologic data in this portion of the site. And then this is a visualization of just the highest relative hydraulic conductivity. So, we looked at all of it and the computer connected all the dots, but then we could turn off everything but the highest hydraulic conductivity, which is kind of corresponds to the sands and sandy silts, the more sandy material. And this has been presented to the CAG a couple of times. I know I brought the 4 DIMMs and could rotate it and move it and zoom in on things. But again, that's hard to do over Zoom. Any questions on that? So the next question is, has the preferential groundwater flow pathway been defined adequately? And again, this was also from the 3DVA. What we could do is put the groundwater potentiometric surface, which is the shallow water table, on a figure, and then these directional lines are placed perpendicular to the groundwater contours. And so, that is a general representation of where groundwater is going. So on section 6, we can tell with some good certainty on where the groundwater flow is happening. And then has the plume been defined in 3 dimensions to include the above mentioned structures? Provide a 3-dimensional map showing the plume. So that is, I think it's under here someplace. Oh, that's a different one. So this is PCE, which is tetrachloroethene, and 1,1-dichloroethene. So these are 2 other chemicals that show the plume. This is 1,4-dioxane. And this is a 3D representation of 1,4-dioxane. And again, we've had quite a bit of discussions about this. So if there's any questions, anything you want to go over, be happy to. And I think that's it for 12.2. Is there any other discussion for 12.2?
So this is Lisa. I just want to jump in. We have 10 more minutes, so I think we do need to wrap it up. We can have quick discussion about 12.2, but I just wanted to acknowledge that there's a remaining 12.3, 4, and 5 of the questions, and how the CAG would like to address that. Perhaps push it to the next CAG meeting, or Bonnie, I'm not sure if you want to weigh in on that.
Yeah, Lisa, we'd like to push this on to the next meeting because we've gotten a lot of information tonight, and I think the rest of it's important too. And so, like we said to you when we were planning, we felt this was going to have to be a two-session meeting. So we'd appreciate that. And also, Tom, is that okay with you? Okay.
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Okay. Then Janine and Lisa, I don't know if this is I wanted to let you know that the CAG has received the RA O&M update, the new book. And like we reported at one of our meetings, the townhomes were no longer on the maps, and they're back. Hello, townhomes. And we're glad for that. Maybe Tim could tell us why they were taken off for a while. And secondly, the reason that we have concerns about these studies and whether or not the various wells are being investigated and what's happening with them is every time we go into a new RA O&M report, we get things back. And I did send some maps today. And Lisa, I don't know if you or Janine have the ability to put those maps up, because, but I'm going to explain them. And if you can't do it tonight easily, then we'll do it next time. But what we found in our review of the maps in the new book versus the old report is that figure 426, and I think get my maps here right, and I think it's, let me see here, 427, I think. We're not in, they're in the old book, and they gave the amounts of 1,4-dioxane in each well, in the wells there. And now this new operation and maintenance report doesn't have these maps where we can see what the levels are doing because of testing and the results that come out in these reports and at the bottom of at the legend. And now it just tells us that the amounts are decreasing or increasing. And this is really hard for the public. You know, on one hand, we've got maps that are telling us what the amounts of 1,4-dioxane in the wells are. And then the next time we get a 6-month report, it comes out with just the amounts are increasing or decreasing. So it was figures 425 and 426 that we had out of the old book that gave us amounts. And then the next maps from this current RA O&M don't have that, so that we can follow it along. In other words, I'd like to know what the levels in the dioxane in these wells is now. And since we had a report last time, last 6 months report, we'd like to know, we would like to see what's happening with the testing in each of those wells. Again.
So I can respond to that.
Sure.
Did you have any other question? Any other follow on, Bonnie? I don't want to interrupt.
Nope, go ahead.
So 426 and 425 and 426, as you can see on the legend, there are potentiometric surface maps.
Yes.
And the intent of those maps is to show water levels and then contours in between the water levels. To your question about, well, what happened to the 1,4-dioxane concentrations, they're shown on figures 427 and 428.
Okay. They're the same thing, they're the same wells? Is that what you're saying? But they're just on different figures?
Yeah, so in section 30 and with section 31, the concentrations are shown on figures 427 and 428.
Okay.
And then on figure 429, the concentrations in section 30, 19, and 24 are shown there. And those wells up north of Yale are only sampled semi-annually. So there's only one set of data for each SSR.
Okay.
Can I clarify? 4.25 and 4.26 were in the 2019 report. Those were entitled Section 31 1,4-dioxane results. They're not in the 2020 report. And what's important is that PTP 25 was at a level of 690, PTP 307 was at a level of 100, PTP 20 was at a level at 120 of 1,4-dioxane. And when I tried to look up in the 2020 report, there's no testing done in those. And these were areas where things were very high. And I would think that, that if you're trying to figure out what's going on at the site, you look at those areas and you keep testing them, even if your original north end evaluation is finished. And the thing about those maps from 2019, they showed 1,4-dioxane with a detection of greater than or equal to 0.9, whereas now the substitute map, which is figure 4.36, which is a whole new map, they've changed the legend to only give you the trends of reporting, not to whether or not they're detected above 0.9 or not. While you're thinking about that, I also want to point out that in 2020 report, maps 4.18 and 4.19, entitled Potentiometric Surface On-Weather Dawson, seem to clearly show flow lines underneath the north boundary barrier wall and around the north boundary wall to the east. Those seem to be coexistent with the sands that we were just shown. And I'm wondering what the EPA and WSDs are planning to do to try to determine whether or not those things are contributing to the increased 1,4-dioxane levels and some other contaminants to the north of the north boundary barrier wall. And because when you're telling us that just because those sand, or because of the pumping in those areas of potable water, there's residual 1,4-dioxane down there, and you're not taking into account any other explanation. And I think the other explanation is that it's coming from the site with the flow lines you show and the sand lenses that you just showed.
So, so Tom, let me try to address the second one first, but I do want to come back. I've got some clarification questions on 436. But the north boundary barrier wall containment system evaluation is going to look in detail about the flow lines in the vicinity of the north boundary barrier wall. So it's premature for anyone here really to say what the significance of the flow lines or the potentiometric head in the unweathered Dawson is underneath upgrading or downgrading to the north boundary barrier wall. So I understand your comment, but maybe just advice would be just to hold that thought and let's wait until the 3-dimensional flow model is used and a detailed characterization of that area is performed before we can answer that question. So on figure 436, I've got it here in front of me. This is a pretty detailed map of 1,4-dioxane concentrations in wells and piezometers throughout the whole north boundary barrier wall area. So which specific wells are you talking about that we're missing data?
I went up and looked to see if any of the data was in the charts as well. And PTP 25, PTP 307, PTP 20, they have not been tested since 2019. I think PTP 20 was last tested in May of 2019, and it was at 120. And it seems to me those are really high concentrations, and you'd be wanting to find out where those things are going and where they came from.
So those sound like those were synoptic sampling wells, and they're not currently being monitored, but a whole bunch of other wells around those wells are. So as you can see on the figure, there's a real good characterization of what's going on north of the wall, as well as trend maps for B326, 313, 103, 77. So
You seem to pick B326 Upper Dawson as a appropriate sample well, where its highest level has ever been since 2005 was a 1,4-dioxane level of 36. So how is that well an example of what's happening when you've got levels up to 600 that you're not following?
So right now we're monitoring water quality in the sand channel associated with the B326 MW113 trough, which is where we have isolated, or if you will, hydraulically contained groundwater movement north of the wall. And what's most important to us right now is what's happening with water quality in that trough. And we're monitoring that very closely.
Well, then I guess explain to me why you're not monitoring those other wells where it's a much higher level.
Because their potentiometric surface looks like their flow lines come into the trough, and we're pumping out of the trough.
So you don't care where those levels got high, how they got there and they're high, whether or not there's another channel that you're not seeing.
Well, there's two questions there. We're evaluating whether there's another channel by virtue of the three-dimensional flow model, and the fact that there may be some higher concentrations in the stagnant area just north of the wall doesn't bother us right now. What matters is that moving? So the question is, what are we doing about that to contain it? And that's why we're monitoring very closely what's going on in the 326-113 trough.
Okay, I'm not saying you shouldn't do monitoring 226-113 trough, but the reason I got those 3 PTP wells is they are all in line with each other. And from north to south. It seems like it's tunnel vision right now. I don't know. At this point, I'm beyond my expertise, so I would appreciate if Dietrich or somebody else would step in and tell me whether or not I'm just full of hot air.
I think those are great questions. I would have to look at the wells and their position, and I would be looking at kind of what we're hearing from about it flowing toward the trough. Also, is there a downward gradient we need to be aware of in the area, and how much that gradient changes? I think it's an interesting question that I'd like to go back to at the next meeting.
So Tom, if you could put that in writing, we'll take a look at it as well and be prepared to talk more about it next month.
Thank you. I'd be glad to.
I was going to suggest. Sure. I thank you for that, Tim. Hopefully, Tom, that'll be satisfactory, so we can tack it on to the other, the remaining questions from the other discussions. So we are clean out of time, overtime now. So unless anyone else has a showstopper question or statement, I think we need to call the meeting to a close. All right. Okay, thank you, everyone. Have a nice night. You can go join the presidential town hall now and have some real fun.
Town halls, plural.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you, bye-bye.
Thank you, Colleen.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Colleen. Are you still here? Oh, she gone.
Yes, I am. Here.
Oh, you are. Okay, this is Richard, and I thank you for chiming in on that water quality group. I'm probably going to be calling you. Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
I'll do the best I can to explain what that other division does,